Now, if we follow this idea that there is controlled and automatic aspects about when stereotypes are activated, there should be some evidence for it that we can find, right? So given what we know about controlled versus automatic processes, we might hypothesize that decreased cognitive resources, so if I just don't have enough processing power available, this should inhibit the simple activation of stereotypes, and that once a stereotype is activated, we need cognitive resources to not let it color our judgment. So decreased cognitive resources should facilitate the application of stereotypes, but not necessarily their activation. Here's some research that tried to see if this is actually the case. So to differentiate between the activation of stereotypes and to question the process that lies beneath this. Is it actually automatic that stereotypes are popping up? And in the study, our design was the following. So participants either saw an Asian or a white woman in a video holding up word fragments that they were asked to complete, and they read like this. So you can see examples for this on the screen. And then there was also a cognitive load manipulation. So to manipulate how many cognitive resources participants had available for them to actually solve this task and complete the words. So for this cognitive load manipulation, participants were asked to, at the same time, memorize an 8-digit number and to hold this in memory. So this would block the mental capacity to activate the stereotype if indeed it required cognitive capacity. So if we take a look at the activation of the stereotype, we can, I should make this clearer here. We can take a look at how the words are completed. So for instance, if the S something Y word would be completed as say, that would be a neutral completion. If it was completed as soy, that would be a completion that would be consistent with the Asian stereotype or activation of Asian stereotypes in this person's mind. Okay, so that's the idea. And now we can take a look at the completion of these words. Oh, sorry. So we can see how many of the words were stereotyped consistently with the race of the person shown in the video. The number of words that were completed in a stereotypical fashion is what's on the y-axis here, and on the x-axis is information about whether participants were in the load versus no load condition. And we have different colored bars. So blue are the words presented by the Asian female holding up the sign, and in red are words presented by the white person holding up the sign. And what do we see? The under cognitive load, there was not a big difference in how many words were stereotyped or activated to conform with the Asian stereotype. But in the no load condition, we can see that it makes a difference whether the person holding up the word was Asian versus white. So if the person was Asian, then the stereotype was activated and more words were completed in the inconsistency with the Asian stereotype compared to when the person holding up the board was white. So what does this mean? The activation of a stereotype requires some mental capacity. So it is not the case that the stereotype only briefly pops up and it doesn't cost us anything, but the activation of the stereotype actually requires mental capacity more than not activating it. Now that's only one study though. Let's take a look at the second study where there was basically the same design to study stereotype activation, but a second task that followed it. So after the word completion task, participants were asked to listen to the same white or Asian assistant talking about her daily life while doing a visual search task. So our visual search task here is the cognitive load manipulation. And what are our dependent variables? First of all, the stereotype activation from the first task, as we've already seen it before. But now we can also take a look at stereotype activation in the second task. Namely, if we take a look at the assignment of negative stereotypical traits to the assistants, depending on the race that they were presented to be. So this means we have basically, oh, that's really tricky to read. I'm sorry about this. You're just going to have to listen really carefully to my explanation. This means we have basically 4 different conditions. So we have the activation phase and we have the application phase, right? And in the activation phase, either participants experienced load or no load. And in the application phase, participants experienced load or no load. And that means we get 4 conditions in the end, where either first, participants never experienced any load. Second, they got load early, so in the first phase only. Third, participants who got load in the third phase only, so they in the second phase only, so the late load. And fourth, participants who got load both in the first and in the second round, so there was always some load on their mental capacity. Okay, and now we can take a look at whether, first of all, we can corroborate the previous results that stereotype activation under load doesn't occur, but it only occurs when there's no load. And whether we can see if the same pattern holds for the application of the stereotype or if that's different. So here is the data, and these are our 4 conditions. So we have on the x-axis the 2 bars for never any load, early load, late load, and always load. And then on the y-axis again we have the number of stereotypical words. So in the that's in the activation phase. Sorry, I must make this really clear. This is in the activation phase, so this is for the first part of the study, which is basically a replication of the results that I've just shown you before, right? Okay, so what we should see is if there's early load, that means in conditions 2 and in condition 4, because both of them, early load only has a load in the activation phase, always load has load in the activation and in the application phase, right? So in these conditions, there is load, and there we should see that the Asian stereotype is not activated. And that's what we see here, right? We see there's no evidence for a big difference between the Asian versus white person prime, so the person holding up the sign being white versus Asian, in how many of the words that participants were supposed to complete were completed in a way that was consistent with the Asian stereotype. But in the never load and the late load condition, these are the ones that didn't have a load induction in this activation task. There we see that the number of words that were completed consistently with the Asian stereotype was higher when the person holding the sign, so the prime, was Asian than when they were white. Okay, so this confirms or corroborates the evidence of the first study that I showed you, that activation takes brain power. Activation takes up cognitive resources, and if cognitive resources are occupied because there's a cognitive load manipulation, then we don't see an activation of the stereotype. Now, what does the application look like? So we know that the activation requires load, but how about the application? So again, we have the never load, early load, and late load, and always load conditions, right? Those are our 4 conditions. And this time our dependent variable is the number of negative stereotypical traits assigned to the person. And what do we see here? So first of all, let's start from the left. The never load condition means that also in the application phase, there is no load, right? But we know from the activation phase, so let's stick with the first 2 bars on the left, the never load condition. we know that the Asian stereotype is activated. It's there. But if we take a look at the application, you can see that it doesn't make a difference. There's no evidence that there's a difference between the Asian and white prime in terms of the stereotypical negative traits assigned to the person. So here we can see that participants control the application of the stereotype. So it's there, it's active in their mind, but it doesn't get applied in actual behavior. It doesn't get applied in the specific situation where participants would have to stereotype the person. Now, let's move one bit to the right, to the early load condition. So in the early load condition, remember that for the activation, we don't see that the stereotype is activated, right? Again, those are the second two bars. So here, the difference between Asian and white prime doesn't give us the impression of a difference in how many stereotypical words were completed, right? So we would say there's no evidence that the Asian stereotype is activated. And now, if we take a look at whether it's applied, the answer is also no. There's also no difference in the number of stereotypical traits assigned to the person, depending on whether they are Asian or white. So early load, there's no activation of the stereotype, and thereafter also no application of it. Okay, so the late load condition. Let's remember again what happened in the activation phase. The late load condition, this is now the third couple of two bars. Here, the stereotype is activated, right? It's there. We have a difference between Asian and white primes in terms of stereotypical words completed. So the activation has taken place, but now will the stereotype be applied? No, because there is now late load, there's cognitive load applied during this task, and participants have no ability to control whether they actually apply the stereotype or not. So the stereotype is activated, and participants can control, don't have resources left over to control the application, so it is applied, and then now we see a difference between the negative stereotypical traits assigned to the Asian and the white woman in this task, in the second task. And then fourth, the always load condition. We have to remember, first of all, was there even an activation of the stereotype? So remember from this slide, is there an activation of the stereotype in the always load condition, the fourth condition we are looking at? The answer is no, right? So the two bars are not markedly different. The stereotype is not activated, and it is also not applied. So because it's not activated, it's then also not applied. Okay, so what does this mean? It means that stereotype activation is decreased by cognitive load. Activating our stereotypes requires some mental capacity. But the application of stereotypes is increased by cognitive load. So suppressing the application of stereotypes requires effort or mental capacity. That means stereotype activation and application have automatic and controlled components.